So, shall we start with the first question, which is just tell us a bit about yourself. What drew you to the field, and what keeps you in this field?
Wow. I started back in 1987. And at that time, I was attending Humboldt State University, getting my master's degree in psychology. And I met Dr. John Morgan and Dr. James Knight. They were conducting studies on event-related potentials. And it was fascinating to me. I was getting my master's degree. I was studying psychobiology in the brain, and I was just fascinated by all of that. And what kind of drew me to it was, I've been a musician my entire life, and the brain was kind of like a musical instrument. It had, so many beautiful tones, if you will. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to learn more about that and how you actually could do something with that, tuning the brain. So I conducted that study. I would end up publishing it and then return back to Los Angeles. And I started working for this one clinician. And I'm very good at computers. I've been kind of a computer nerd my entire life. And at that time, there was my supervisor had a friend, and her computer wasn't working well, and she needed some help, and so he sent me to Beverly Hills to her clinic, and I walked in there, and there was standing Margaret Ayers, who created the first real-time neurofeedback device that was patented in the United States back in the early 90s. And Margaret was really sweet to me, and she took me to UCLA Medical Center, where I watched her take a person out of a level 2 coma using neurofeedback by itself. And pretty much set me on my ear. Everything I had learned about the brain was changed inside of just a couple hours, and I was very distraught because I was planning on being a medical psychologist that prescribed medications, and she said, if you want, you can join me in this, and because we can really do some really great things. And I thought, I watched something that defied the science that I had, learned up to that point in time. And it was so intriguing to me, I just could not look away from it. I thought, this is the way to go. And so for years, I would end up following Margaret's work and learning how to do all the things that she did, and then would graduate to other systems. And I started to collect them and learn them. And a lot of it out of curiosity, a lot out of clinical utility, what worked well for what. And so, I'm always genuinely interested in that kind of technology. And when it works really well, it's amazing to watch somebody get better. And so what keeps on drawing me back was seeing people heal and seeing people get better, and in ways that were just astonishing. And I look at it with just nothing but wonder.
It might be interesting for people to hear what you did look at. Like you started with Margaret Ayers' technology. What were some of the other steps along the way for you?
Oh, well, I would end up getting into other systems, like the Lens system with Lennox, and the Brainmaster system, and then the Nexus system, and then the J&J system. All of them they all had, they were kind of like, it's kind of like cooking with different spices. They all had the little things that they could do that were really interesting to me. And knowing how to put them together was really the trick. Knowing how to combine them, knowing what to use for what. That was really interesting to me. And what really fascinated me was the quantification of EEG, looking at multiple channel recordings and how we could actually see the brain work on a giant scale, so to speak. It just blew me away when I started to get to do those things, which is what we continue to do to this day.
So what makes you stay with this? What
Yeah.
makes you keep going?
Well, people get better, and they get better in a lot of different ways. But I think I'm right now. I've always been genuinely just fascinated with the technology. Using just a hint of energy to stimulate the brain and watch the brain change and
Mhm.
correct itself. I love to see the science behind it. We're doing machine learning now and 19 and 38 channel recordings of the EEG and using artificial intelligence to tell us where an electrical source rests in a three-dimensional system, and using Granger causality models for connectivity, looking at what causes what to fire and how this little symphony fires off, and where it doesn't, and then creating tests around that actually show us just an amazing amount of information. I've actually circled all the way back to event related potentials again. In
Right.
2018, I picked it all up again and then wrote another go no go program, and now we're using this machine learning pipeline to analyze the ERP data, which I think is incredibly precise,
Mhm.
and just amazing. And on your side of the world, you have Yuri, that is he's I think probably the leading pioneer in ERP technology. I've
Mhm.
read all his books, and I'm just genuinely fascinated on what we could do with that. I think there's so much clinical utility and so many
Mhm.
things that these little signatures can show us about functionality in the brain. And when you
Mhm.
utilize different methods for treating those issues, the ERP is sensitive enough to show you that. And what keeps on coming back to me is like it's kind of like an unsolvable puzzle. It's massive,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's really intriguing because it's like, oh, we just
Yeah.
found another
Yeah.
piece of it, and then you see somebody respond,
Yeah.
and yeah, time and time again, it just keeps on happening.
Yeah.
So that's enough for
Could
me.
could you maybe give an example or two, out of the many that you must have of just I like your metaphor of the combination of spices, um, of how your technology's been combined, or how you've picked and chosen in a couple of sort of little clinical vignettes, maybe?
Oh yeah, we've combined it with a lot of different modalities: speech therapy, physical therapy, psychotherapy, and it was really interesting to see um, people respond. Like, for instance, EMDR, for instance. I was trained by Francine Shapiro in EMDR in 1994. And
Mhm.
at that time, I remember sitting in a lecture where she was saying that they really didn't know the mechanism of action of EMDR. They just knew that the eye movement had something to do with it. And
Yeah.
flash forward 15 years, and all of a sudden, I'm sitting there holding a alternating current, direct current device that we developed, and my engineer is going over the specifications of the device, saying, "Well, it can generate frequencies from this to this to this." And I thought, "Oh, wow, we could actually mimic lateral eye movement." And he said,
Wow.
"Oh yeah, we totally could do that." And it was just like, wow, okay, so what would happen if we did that in lieu of the actual hand movements that somebody would normally do with the MDR? And just
Yeah.
as we were talking about that, a paper had been published. It was just serendipitous. This paper was published talking about calcium and sodium ion activation in the astrocytes, and
Mhm.
how a DC stimulation would actually cause these calcium and sodium ions to surge in the astrocytes, giving rise to a hyper accelerated form of conductivity. And I mean, I was reading this paper, and I got this really cool shiver because I remember when Dr. Shapiro was asked about that mechanism of action, she said she didn't know, but she believed that it was associated with the glia.
Oh,
And I just, those two kind of came together for me right on the spot. And I thought the eyes were a DC capacitor. And when you move them back and forth, it was creating that kind of stimulation that would hit the astrocytes, cause them to surge, giving rise to an abreaction, and then moving the person through the scenario that would be EMDR therapy. And I thought
yeah.
maybe we could actually do that using this technology and do it in a smoother way instead of just using our finger, which is kind of barbaric when you think about it, right? And so there's only so many other ways of doing it. And we did. And we found that not only did it work, but it worked better than the other methods because it never stopped. It was just continuously running while you went through this. And we found you know, that people had these really great psychotherapy breakthroughs and changes, and particularly with a group of first responders. I'm the executive director, aside with all the other stuff I do, I'm an executive director of a program in Florida called FHE Health, and we have a program there called Shatterproof. And that's all these first responders, you know, police, fire, military, and
Uh-huh.
all these guys that have suffered significant PTSD. And so
Okay. Yeah.
we've trained the therapist on how to use this method. And
Yeah.
we have a number of labs set up there, and they started using it. And we found that not only did it help to reduce the symptoms of anxiety and depression um, statistically, you know, but you know, we were taking measures like the GAD-7 and the PHQ-9 and other measures showing significant outcomes within a pretty short period of time where they stabilized.
Hmm.
Um, so it was like, wow, you know, that there's all these methods of being able to combine these neurostimulation methods with legitimate psychotherapy methods to
Hmm.
accelerate an outcome. That's
Hmm.
just like one of many. We've done it with speech therapy, where people were able to regain the ability to speak. Physical therapy, where people worked with a physical therapist simultaneously while we're stimulating the motor cortex, and they would be able to regain physical movement.
Hmm.
So there's some pretty cool stuff that came together.
Hmm. Hmm. Maybe, you know, that sounds very interesting. The program for the first responders, which you said, I didn't catch the name,
Shatterproof.
Shadowproof, right,
Yeah.
right. And are there other examples that you know of where the Neurofield technology is being used, you know, in specific programs?
Well, for drug addiction, for opioid, benzodiazepine, and alcohol rehabilitation programs. We have been using it there. And we just completed a 4-year study looking at the impact of combining neurostimulation with rehabilitation. And we're able to show that significant reductions in anxiety and depression in all of those populations. Um, and we were able to show that the length of stay in which they, you know, engaged in the rehabilitation program went up from roughly 20 days to 42 days
Uh-huh.
in 1 year, and that the recidivism rate dropped from roughly 30% to 3.9%
Mhm.
inside of this period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, it was pretty
And which,
impressive.
yeah, which particular, what was the spice mix in that program?
Well,
Or is it a combination? Yeah, just
yeah,
interested to hear.
you know,
Yeah.
we put together each one of the drugs had a specific type of impact on the brain. So
Mm.
um, opioids, for instance, impact the pain network, which prevents the anterior cingulate and the posterior cingulate from being able to switch on and off correctly. And so that
Mm.
pain network becomes compromised, and you stay activated in your anterior cingulate, which makes you
Mm.
susceptible to pain. And
Mm.
this is based on studies that a lot of people have done, but Dirk de Ritter was one of them who
Yeah.
had talked about this extensively.
Mm.
And he was the one that suggested the idea to me that, boy, wouldn't it be great if we had a DC stimulator that could turn on the anterior cingulate, but turn off the posterior cingulate for 10 seconds and then switch it. And I said, well, what
Mhm.
you're describing is a 10-second square wave. And he said, can you do that? And I said, yeah. And so we developed it. And then we started using it on people with opioid addiction. And, as they were going through, detox, and we found
Mhm.
that uh, it cut the cravings significantly on a daily basis to where they didn't want to leave the program against medical advice. And so
Mhm.
they would stay engaged. And then
Mhm.
it helped to resolve sleep issues really quickly. So within 5 to 7 days, they reported sleeping correctly. And then we saw the changes in anxiety and depression with them as well. And so,
Mhm.
you know, what was interesting, we kept the therapist blind to what we were doing with the neurostimulation. And we would give them the treatments and then set them loose in group therapy and in individual therapy. And the reports we received back were these guys are engaging in the process. They're actually talking. What's going on? They're not just sitting there silently, but they're actually talking. And we
Mhm.
found that, yeah, it does facilitate movement. Obviously, if your brain starts to change and you start to function differently, perhaps you'll actually start talking about the issues that are bothering
Yeah. 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 Oh, very, very interesting. Are there any settings that you know of where your equipment's being used with kids, in some quite comprehensive way? Any school settings or programs for children?
There's quite a few therapists that utilize it for children that have pervasive developmental issues, such as autism and Asperger's, and ADHD, for instance,
Mhm.
attention deficit, uh, and children that have issues like dyslexia, reading issues, learning problems, those kinds of things. And so, yeah, it's been utilized in those scenarios as well, with quite good success. They're
Mhm.
showing significant changes, um, uh, mainly in the ADHD population, where we see, well, autism as well, but with the ADHD population, what we saw in the ERP actually replicated what Yuri describes in terms of theta beta, frontal theta beta synchronization. And we started to observe that as well. And so simply giving an SMR stimulation from 13 to 15 cycles per second to
Mhm.
the frontal lobe helped to restore that synchronization. And so when
Mhm.
we actually gave the test again, we saw a spectral potential that was quite synchronized, and then the
Mhm.
reaction times were faster.
Mhm.
This led to better functionality in the child, where they could actually learn and engage better in the classroom.
Right. Right. Um, This is going maybe a little bit more technical, but the integration of traditional sort of operant conditioning-based neurofeedback and the STIM technologies. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I want to say in 2000, I believe it was 2010. It might have been 2011. But at that time, we developed a synchronized methodology that would allow you to set up both modalities, and have them run one at a time. So you could set up for instance, a neurofeedback protocol, um, and
Mhm.
run that for 5 minutes, and then have it shut off, and then the neurostimulation protocol would turn on, and then give itself for X amount of time.
Mhm.
And we found that we created a dynamic priming system that would allow, let's say you were down training theta and up training
Mhm.
beta. um, and you wanted to see the brain produce more beta. Well, you could set up the neurofeedback protocol to down train the theta, right? And then when it shut off after a couple of minutes, the neurostimulation program would turn on and give the beta that you want to see the brain uptrain. right?
Mm.
And we were able to set these dynamic rules that was looking at the end of every round of neurofeedback, saying, did the brain achieve the state that you wanted to see it achieve? In other words, did theta decrease and beta increase? And if it did within a certain percentage level, then the computer would make a decision about what frequency actually facilitated this change. And it would actually turn on the stimulator at that level. So we've had that in play now for quite some time. It's been
Mhm.
well over 13 years. So, or
Oh,
13 years, somewhere around
yeah.
there.
Oh, very, very interesting and a very succinct explanation there. Great. Um, can you tell us where your technology is being used that you know of? What parts of the world?
Wow. Well, obviously all over the United States, but there have been practitioners that have come from everywhere, really. Australia, Japan,
Mm.
Canada, South America, the UK, Europe, multiple places in Europe,
Yeah.
Russia. Um, yeah, they're
Yeah.
everywhere.
Any idea how many Neurofield systems are in use in the
Ooh,
world,
that's a good question.
approximately?
I don't think I have that answer. Wow. Because there's, it's a hard one to drum up. There's multiple iterations of our devices, and so we've had different ones that have been out there. And so with our neurofeedback device, I believe there's several thousand out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all over the world. I know there is a few in New Zealand too.
Right. Right.
Okay. We've we've actually covered pretty much what was in the questions.
Okay.
Um, maybe just we can speak a little bit to the future. What do you, if you were going to say the blue sky future of your products and this whole neuromodulation field, what comes to mind?
Well, I think there's when I think about the future, obviously machine learning and artificial intelligence is I think it's a necessary component in understanding the brain and understanding things that are extremely complicated. The computers have the ability to be able to do things that we simply can't do with other quantification methods. So I think as we come together as a field, which what I'd like to see, an integration of these ideas, integration of these analysis technologies, I think we can better illuminate um, what is going on with the brain.
Mhm.
And
When you say come together as a field, what what do you mean by come together as a
well,
field?
I think there's a lot of, when I look at all the competing technologies, there's a lot of
Mhm.
proprietary methods. There's a lot of methods where people want to they want to own a little corner of it,
Mhm.
and some are, in my opinion, are more than happy to communicate and be part of a bigger picture. And then there are others that do not. And I think that does slow down the innovations. I think it does impact us as a whole. I think it's
Mhm.
something where we really have to think about how we present ourselves to the world, because we have that ethical responsibility.
Mhm.
And that's why everything that we do, we talk about. That's why all our technology is open source. So we're engaging with academic neuroscience, and
Yeah.
we've made a handshake with them so that we can be up to speed with the state of the art. And that's a process that we're happy to talk about and to
Yeah.
to move to. And I think
Yeah.
that that's what we need to do to understand this organ that we claim to treat and measure.
Mm.
85 billion neurons with over 100 trillion synaptic and dendritic connections that creates roughly 7 quadrillion events per second.
Yeah.
That just happens. You know,
Yeah. Huh.
I think we have to be pretty respectful of that. You know, and I think and I think as we pull our resources together and have more of these kinds of meetings and we talk to each other and we start to share these ideas, that's what coming together really means.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
because
mm.
we all see the utility in it. I think that we're genuinely fascinated. There's so many cool people in this field that has so many good ideas. And so I know people see it.
Mm, mm. Great. There, thank you. So anything else you'd like to put in that you feel we haven't covered in our conversation?
Um, well, I think we're good. Yeah, I feel like we kind of covered where we are and what the system does. Um, I'm honored that you guys allowed me to do this. I think it's great, and I'm sad that we're not there, but maybe
Yeah.
another time. But
Mm,
yeah, I think what I want to leave everybody with is we got to keep on pushing forward. We got to keep on innovating. We have to come up with ideas that stand the test of science, but also relate to the heart and to the spirit and to the human condition, and not to get lost in just one of those things, but to try to integrate them all,
mm,
which is just a monumental challenge. Um,
mm.
but it's one that I think has integrity, and I think it's something that we should aspire to do.
We're beautifully said.